Welcome to Analyzing Finance with Nick. I'm live here in Rapperswil, Switzerland, and I'm going to be discussing the economic future of Switzerland. Switzerland has been the one country in Europe that has been able to not only keep up with the US, but maintain a higher GDP per capita than the US and continue to grow despite the struggles in the surrounding countries. Why is Switzerland so successful? Can that success scale to other countries? And can that success the foreseeable future? In this video, I'll be investigating that and I'll be showing highlights from my time in Switzerland throughout this video.
Will Switzerland remain the most prosperous country in Europe and the most well-run government in the world? Welcome to Analyzing Finance with Nick. We are continuing our Economic Futures Revival series with the economic future of Switzerland, which was also a stop on the Analyzing Finance with Nick tour. We went to Zurich. I'm going to include some highlights from my time in Switzerland, but I'll give you a more boots on the ground kind of perspective. In general, Switzerland still has the strongest fundamentals really of any country in Europe. It's one of the few places on the continent that still has a free market outlook in a continent that is mostly kind of just decided to give up its economic dynamism to provide comfortable retirements for their boomer generations. Switzerland is facing challenges with tariffs as they are struggling, as of I'm recording this, with negotiating with the my insight is Switzerland is not charging like exorbitant tariffs to the US. And this is more just the Trump administration being unhappy with a large trade deficit with the Swiss. And that's not because necessarily the Swiss buy a lot. And actually, from a per capita basis, they probably buy more in American imports than Americans buy in Swiss exports. The problem is just that the value created in Switzerland and the efficiency in how they produce things means that the value of their exports exceeds American imports. If you don't want the U.S. to import so much from Switzerland, the U.S. needs to make better stuff than Switzerland. I think that they'll ultimately come sort of deal. I think that Switzerland will buy some more American things that they need to try to balance that number, and they come to some sort of compromise, because it's ridiculous that Switzerland is facing double tariffs of the rest of Europe. Outside of like the tariff commentary, let's kind of go into a deeper dive of what makes Switzerland successful. What makes Switzerland successful is embracing the free market, geopolitical and economic stability, and just a general efficiency of how things are run there. Like the trains always run on time in Switzerland. And the Swiss voters and the Swiss electorate have a more direct democracy, but they use it correctly. Like they rejected universal basic income when it came on the ballot, whereas just about probably any other country in Europe would have voted for it overwhelmingly. They've also been good at managing immigration much better than the rest of Europe. And they have a healthcare system less burdensome to the taxpayers. They have probably the best immigration of any public and private sector cooperation of any developed country in the world in terms of how they run their healthcare system. The fact that nobody really knows who the president of Switzerland is a sign that their government stays confined, small, and doesn't disrupt the general business world or the culture there. You also hear about politicians in the news outside of your local country's leadership because they are either forcing geopolitical might elsewhere or doing a very controversial or bad job. That's usually why you hear about national leaders. Whereas you never really hear about the national leaders of Switzerland because they quietly run things very efficiently. I gotta disclose my biases before I keep going. I am half Swiss by blood and I have Swiss citizenship, even though I spent most of my life in the United States, have sympathy for the motherland. So if I come off as a Swiss homer, that's why. If I'm rooting for any national team outside the US in any sort of the World Cup or the Olympics, it's going to be Switzerland. They generally just have a very streamlined economy. They have lower taxes than the rest of Europe. And in some cantons like Zug, they're extremely low because Switzerland only has a 12% federal tax. And the rest of the income taxation is decided on the canton level, which are kind of like very small versions of like US states, except it's a lot more federalized and decentralized even than the United States. So if you live in a high tax canton, you're probably paying similar taxes to living in a blue state in the US. Whereas if you live in a very low tax canton, you're paying as low as 12% on a place like Zug. So it's very different tax structure than the United States. And also because people trust them so much, the franc consistently appreciates versus other currencies. In the 1950s, the Swiss franc was 5 to the dollar. Now it's $1.2 for a Swiss franc. And even as recently as the late 90s, when the first time I went to Switzerland, a franc was only 80 cents to the US dollar. It just continues to rise because Switzerland is a trusted place for capital. A common lesson in economics is that money goes where it's treated the best. There are a few places where capital is treated better than Switzerland. Like the countries where generally capital is treated well are the US, Singapore, and Switzerland. As a result, these countries have consistently net capital inflow, both in terms of financial capital and also human capital, a sense of wealthy, high net worth individuals who have geographic flexibility choose to move to these places versus their home countries. Switzerland has a long tradition of banking. There have had some struggles recently with the failure of Credit Suisse and its forced consolidation to UBS. But generally, Switzerland is regarded for its banking. It's not really, doesn't offer the secrecy advantages that it used to, especially for American citizens, thanks to FATCA. But it's still generally regarded as a safe place to hold money, especially if you're a more geopolitically sensitive country or a country that historically has confiscatory level of taxes. Switzerland also is an innovator. They're a leader in pharmaceuticals. They are a leader in specialty advanced manufacturing. Like the most famous example are like Rolex watches and Victorinox Swiss Army knives. And they have some of the major global power corporations based in Switzerland, such as Nestle, UBS, Roche, and several others. So it definitely outpunches its weight. It's a country with 8 million people, yet it has some of the most leading world-class companies based out of there. A lot of European headquarters of multinationals are based in Switzerland due to favorable taxation and a better place to attract talent relative to other parts of Europe. And Switzerland, because of all its prosperity, has much higher salaries than the rest of Europe and even has higher average salaries than the US. But when you adjust for the cost of living there, because things are very expensive, like housing is similar in prices to like California, but the cost of living of everything else is even more inflated. Going out to eat provides a lot of sticker shock when you go to Switzerland. Because of that, the purchase power parity adjusted wages are still high and higher than pretty much all of Europe except for maybe Norway. So your cost of living is expensive, but your money goes farther. It's probably the best country to be a tourist because everything is cheap compared to your home country. But that is kind of the examples of what Switzerland does right. Innovation, efficiency, government knowing its bounds, and maintaining international trust and neutrality. Switzerland has not been involved in a major war since the Napoleonic Wars. It stayed out of World War I and World War II. And so as a result, a lot of international organizations headquarter themselves in Switzerland. A lot of peace deals and international disputes are negotiated in Switzerland. And it's become a very trustworthy place because they know how to stay out of other people's conflicts. And wars are expensive. Even though there's GDP growth technically from building the arsenal, if that's just used to destroy property, it's essentially a broken window fallacy. And if it's never used, it's just money wasted building weapons that are never deployed. So the fact that Switzerland does have its own army to defend itself, and it kind of has to, given that it can't really make alliances with people. But the fact that they stay out of foreign conflicts allowed their wealth to compound from a much higher base than the rest of Europe, where most of Europe saw 20 to 50% or more of its capital stock and assets and industrial capacity destroyed due to bombing and damage from the world wars. Switzerland never had that because they were not attacked. And that's where they really got their head start in the aftermath of World War II. Switzerland was a relatively prosperous country in line with the rest of Western Europe before that, but they really took the lead after World War II due to the fact that they avoided the damage of the war. Switzerland has a very good education system. So where does this leave Switzerland for the future? Its past has been great. It's got, again, a $95,000 USD GDP per capita average, which is the highest in Europe other than Luxembourg. And it is an export powerhouse, and it has very low interest rates and solid economic growth. But that's all great now. The problem is, what is the future of Switzerland? Will it be sunk by the rest of Europe? That's really the big question. Switzerland avoided the great inflation of the rest of the world at the expense of the Swiss franc further appreciating. Switzerland is a perfect example of why a strong currency is a good thing and not a bad thing. If it's a strong currency, people want to invest in your country and store money there. That will strengthen it further. It makes imports cheaper. If you have a lot of imported goods, like or raw materials you import to make manufactured goods, it increases your margins compared to other countries. And you have more political stability because inflation isn't a political problem that eats away at your socio-cultural institutions. Switzerland has 0% inflation and kept inflation extremely low, while the rest of Europe had structurally high inflation due to the pandemic. Swiss inflation never went above 3.5% during the post-pandemic boom, whereas many countries in Europe saw double-digit inflation, and the US got as high as 9% inflation. It has a very strong positive trade surplus of 5%. GDP growth rate's only about 2%, but that's higher than the Netherlands and considerably higher than most of the European Union in real terms. Its unemployment rate for a continent that struggles with relatively high unemployment is 2.7%, which is way lower than the United States, half of that of the state of California, and for European standards is almost like a negative employment rate. So everything's kind of humming about as well as it can get. With that backdrop, what are the things that can really possibly derail Switzerland? First one, like the rest of Europe, is high cost of living. Even though wages are higher in Switzerland than other parts of Europe, cost of living, particularly housing costs, provide a lot of stress for people. Like the average GDP per capita in California is higher than Switzerland, but they have similar housing costs. I'm talking about higher end places in California, like Orange County, coastal LA, and San Francisco. The other thing is tariff negotiation, which I talked about earlier. The US tariffs Switzerland, that's going to be really hard for them because they rely on exports to larger markets because they can't really consume all of the goods they make themselves just because it's a small country. And then the aging population and EU membership. Switzerland is not an EU member. And there's a lot of advantages that they don't have to sink them down with a lot of the EU regulations that are holding down the rest of it. And let's say, for example, Switzerland continues to prosper at the expense of the EU. The EU could potentially embargo or blockade or put massive trade penalties to try to force Switzerland to conform to EU standards. That's a real risk for Switzerland. I don't see it as very likely because it would be very damaging to the EU itself to do that. A lot of countries outside the EU would probably take side with Switzerland if they tried to do that. But it is a risk. Generally, aging population is a problem like anywhere else, but to just a more mild degree. They do have a lot of foreign workers, but they don't really give them citizenship. And a lot of them commute in from bordering countries such as Germany, Italy, and France. So it's a different dynamic there. Currency strength can be a problem too. If the currency gets too strong, their exports become competitive and nobody wants to travel there because it's too expensive. High levels of debt in the real estate market because interest rates have been so low, they've held them negative during the ZERP era because of too much inflows of Swiss franc. You've got an overvaluation of residential property because you can buy a lot more with rates being down. The other thing is the Swiss banking system is losing relative competitiveness to other countries because of changing in Swiss bank secrecy laws and just in general, like a lot of financial innovation is happening more in the United States. The US is generally regarded as a tax haven for foreigners for the reasons I did in my video discussing the US being the country club of the rich. US wealth management firms and US banks have become a viable competitor for international wealth. And that is another possible risk for Switzerland. Have a lot of electricity generated from abundant hydropower locally and some nuclear power plants, but it imports all of its oil and gas needs, which make it vulnerable to global energy markets. They also import food, and Nestle is a big Swiss powerhouse company, even though they're a big food producer. Switzerland does not have enough agriculture to supply all of its food needs for economic activity as well. Overall, Switzerland manages this very well. Like Switzerland's risks are incredibly minor to everybody else. I think the main risk is the EU sinking it, whether the EU economy struggling brings down Switzerland with it, or the EU threatening to change the rules of the game with Switzerland in order to put them in their place. But now that we're trying to talk about the risk factors, let's talk about our comparison, like we like to do to every one of these videos, the US state. In Switzerland's case, I'm comparing it to the state of Massachusetts. Switzerland's a little bigger than Massachusetts. It's about the size of Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island combined. They are both some of the wealthiest parts of their region, and their economies are close enough in size that I'd like to use them as a comparison. Switzerland has a population of 8.5 million versus 7 million in Massachusetts. A fun fact about Switzerland is the Swiss diaspora, which I consider myself to be a part of, is about the same size as the amount of Swiss live in Switzerland. So there's 8 million in the Swiss diaspora versus 8.5 million people living in Switzerland itself. If you narrow it down to ethnic Swiss, the diaspora is likely bigger than the home nation of Swiss people. The GDP in Switzerland nominally is 942 billion versus 781 billion for Massachusetts. GDP per capita is very similar. It's 107,000 in Switzerland nominal. It's 95 and 110,000 in Massachusetts. So it's slightly higher actually in Massachusetts. Financial services, they're both major financial services hubs in the world, whereas Switzerland's specialty is particularly wealth management and insurance, like Zurich Re, UBS on the wealth management side are two of the biggest firms in those fields. Boston is also an insurance hub with companies like Mass Mutual and John Hancock, whereas they also are a big mutual fund hub with companies like Fidelity being based in Massachusetts or Wellington and other old-time Boston-style mutual funds. This is where the mutual fund industry in America really started to develop, and it's still kind of a center piece of it. They also have a lot of non-financial industries, but this is where they differ. Switzerland's non-financial industries are mainly specialty manufacturing. They are involved in pharmaceuticals, but Switzerland's niche is specialty manufacturing of all kinds, whereas Massachusetts' non-financial industry is the stereotypical Rust Belt post-manufacturing diversification strategy. They just did a lot better of a job of it than other states, which is the education and healthcare, or eds and meds. They can do a much better job at it because Boston became a big VC healthcare pipeline because of all the talent coming out of its universities, and they have both Harvard and MIT based in Greater Boston. They also have other ones like Tufts, BU, Boston College, Northeastern, etc. But it's really Harvard and MIT that kind of carry Boston as America's greatest college town and the education driven part of Boston's economy. And did I have tour stops in both of these places? Yes, I did. In Switzerland, we had it in Zurich in early September. And in Massachusetts, we had it in Boston in late September. So we managed to stop in both cities this year. So overall, what do I think about Switzerland's economy? I think it's actually in much better shape than Massachusetts. And I'll explain why. I think Massachusetts might be at risk of being disrupted in a future video where I show you records of my speech in Boston. But I think Switzerland is in the best shape of any economy in Europe by a considerable margin. They have the anti-fragility of a diversified economy in multiple sectors with leading companies. They have very well-run governance, and they're using it in a way to keep the prosperity going. Their geopolitical neutrality and their rule of law and their embrace of the free market makes them very internationally credible and very trustworthy. And that trust is Switzerland's greatest asset. And I don't see it going away anytime soon. I think Switzerland will continue to do well no matter what happens in the global economy. And in a world of AI, where raw population numbers don't mean geopolitical might anymore, because you can do more with robots and software, it's countries like Switzerland and to a lesser degree like the Netherlands and can push more influence and do a lot more with a lot less resources. So I think Switzerland is a big winner of the AI and robotics revolution. In fact, they are one of the companies that joint headquarters with Sweden for ABB, which is one of the biggest industrial robotics companies. So it's kind of on brand for them already. Let me know. Am I too bullish on Switzerland? If there's some big risk, let me know. Or if I'm wrong, what's a country in Europe that you think is going to do better than Switzerland in the next 10 to 20 years? And if I'm right, what are some reasons that I'm missing? Let me know your thoughts on this. And I look forward to continuing this series as I travel for the tour in 2026 and beyond. Thank you for watching.